Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first session of Coemergence, Contemporary Criticism in Eastern Praxis by Chung. Let me just briefly read the description, the seminar. Art is long sheltered close to power with the attendant fate of being held too tightly at times and at others of being banished to the periphery. In struggles over the meaning of the word, its heft, reach, and projectile force, warring scholars have nevertheless insisted on the necessary praxis of reading, writing, worlding. In the early 20th century, debates on the problem of literary realism, which often had matters of life and death in the balance, made multiple claims on the revolutionary power of narrative without fully accounting for the source of its effective power. The related problem of reflection and critical thought, which sought to decolonize the episteme of imperial systems of representation by utilizing the praxis of self-reflexivity, left incompletely answered the question of what vitalizes that performative turn to itself. This seminar proposes to map an older terrain into this familiar modern route within critical theory by engendering four new encounters in thought between the contemporary field of criticism and Eastern philosophy, limited here to select instances in Chinese philosophy and Tibetan Buddhism. From the latter, we will draw on concepts related to perception, affect, sign, and vision to open up dimensions of the aesthetic experience as the direct basis for transformation. Methodologically, our inquiry recognizes from the outset that the ground for comparison is far from stable. In particular, the rhetoric of Eastern instruction, which will feature in some of the primary texts, differs from the language of philosophy and literature and how it may affect our ability to hold as pure idea, contrasting notions of praxis. The basic curiosity we harbor over the question of how an aesthetic experience changes us will have to be re-articulated repeatedly as we shift our intellectual terrain. In this sense, the course will be conducted in part as itself an experiment in the praxis of aesthetic form. Reading materials will include Shigehi Sakuriyama's The Expressiveness of the Body and the Divergence of Greek and Chinese Medicine, François Julien's Detour and Access, Gidi Ifergan's Longchenpa and Praxis, Its Negation and Liberation, Giorgio Agamben's The Use of Bodies, and Gilles Deleuze's Expressionism and Philosophy, as well as selected excerpts from primary philosophical texts. Additionally, in our discussions, we will refer to varied examples from literature, film, and visual arts as we explore our own critical abilities to think and to write through the key concepts of the course. In a series of four brief encounters, we will try to pinpoint the very instant of creation as such. To this end, we will look into paintings, sculptures, installations, embodiments, and atmospheric phenomena. If you have any question, just put it in the chat. So, Una, please take it away.
Hi, everybody. It's great to meet you all here. I think I will give a brief introduction to myself and then ask everyone just to say where you are and maybe a couple words about your motivation for being here. So to that end, I'll just share my screen. Oops, sorry, that was the wrong one. Okay, so just by way of introduction, I wanted to refer to this video game created by 15 indigenous youth in Hawaii. And it was part of an initiative driven in part by an organization and teachers in Hawaii that teaches digital media, and then the Montreal-based initiative for Indigenous Futures. And I bring this up at the beginning because I think it's actually an interesting example of the encounter of, an encounter with indigenous, non-Western, alternative epistemologies. There's a lot of interest in that, and I think we have to relate to that first as a way of, sorry about that, as a way of entering into our own class. So in this game called He Aohu, A New World, these middle school kids learn video game programming and invent this game as a way to envision their own vehicle into the future. And I think it's a really provocative cultural event in the sense of claims being made on the future by all kinds of technology developers, all kinds of industry leaders, and these kids imagining becoming programmers as a way to participate in that future. And at the same time, there are a lot of other kinds of scholars, anyone from Jane Bennett to, well, so many, who are interested in all kinds of non-Western thought, just kind of give it a reductive frame, as a way to, again, find a way to the future, as a way to find different, better, other kinds of ecological thought, philosophical approaches that attend to planetary needs, climate change. So I think this is a bit of the context in which we're engaging in our inquiry here. And in this little post I wrote for a website, I just invite people to contemplate the juxtaposition between this video game as a kind of vehicle of indigeneity into the future, and then the Voyagers launched by NASA, taking, you probably all know, like a phonograph with thousands of different human languages. I'll stop sharing. But I just offer that as a kind of image of two different ways of thinking about the planet, thinking about cultural multiplicity, cultural difference, of thinking alternative epistemologies, and thinking futurity of technology. All of that together is a bit of my motivation for engaging with this class. And I'll talk about Naoki Sakai first, but in the course of that piece, Sakai talks about the epistemic subject versus the practical subject, or the agent of practice. And what I offer you today comes from both of those positions for myself. On the one hand, studying 20th century critical theory, and then on the other hand, sort of a lifetime as a practitioner in specific traditions I'll present to you, mostly Dzogchen, but also some Taoism. So I'm telling you this not as a kind of, well, I guess this is where as an introduction gives credentials, but I'm offering an interruption perhaps into my own credentialing, and to invite you to consider what you bring in terms of both your own position as a subject of knowledge, but maybe you're also a practitioner in other kinds of cultural forms, modes of knowing, modes of engagement. And this might be an interesting class to contemplate how those can go together. So that said, I think we're not too many. We could just briefly go around. If everyone could say, I would like to know just where you are. And if you just want to say just a couple words, something very brief about your entry into this class. So I guess I'll just call on names as I see them. Andrew McCarroll.
Oh boy, you gotta have me start, okay. So I'm from California. The reason why, aside from, we'll just quote this as the reason, is that while I've had some exposure more in my beginnings of intellectual thought through like the Gnostic Gospels, but also things like the Bhagavad Gita, what I have noticed at the very least is that it seems to be getting harder in a way. Maybe it's just because of how circular a lot of knowledge production tends to be, to get a purchase into like Eastern or so-called Eastern modalities and traditions of thought. So I figured that getting into this would not only also help sharpen my kind of ability to understand visual art, but also to help gain a purchase into working with and through and around Eastern modalities and traditions of knowledge, that sort of thing.
Excellent, thank you so much. Atifa Ahmadi. And please correct me if I'm pronouncing your names wrong.
Yes, my name is Atife. You can call me Ati. Everybody calls me Ati. And I'm from Iran, but currently I live in Poland. I am an MA student in gender studies. And actually, I'm more into my interests are more in arts and literatures. And actually, I had a BA in performance studies and theater. And so as for this seminar, my current program actually is full of like decolonial theories and post-colonial approaches, and it somehow bothered me. Like the kind of approach is usually mostly just this binary theories that they claim to surpass the binaries, but actually they're reinforcing the binaries. It's not about really exploring new kind of knowledge seeking or new kinds of way of thinking, but it is actually more about identity politics that I'm not really a fan of. So I thought maybe this would be a good place for me to find new approaches and find new ways to explore this so-called Eastern-Western problematic.
You're definitely in the right place. So glad to have you with us. Jessica Kenny.
Hello, I'm on what is traditionally Chumash, Tongva, Kawia, Luiseño, Gabrielino, and many other tribes' lands. And now it's where I am specifically, it's called Pasadena. But I'm a singer and a writer, and my practice is really focused around the interaction of those two elements. Also lifelong practitioner of some modalities involving Qigong, traditional Chinese medicine, traditional Korean medicine. And this book, Expressiveness of the Body, is one of my favorite books of all time. So I'm very excited to be in this class with all of you. I'm working on a project to teach a class at CalArts on medical history and the voice. So I'm hoping to develop some of those ideas through this study. Thank you.
Oops. Thank you. We have a lot in common. Mateus Ferreira.
Hi, I'm Mateus. I'm here in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. I'm researching in philosophy, and I'm also sort of a practitioner in Eastern praxis in a sense. I mean, I've been studying Zen Buddhism and Taoism and things like that for a while, and also in my research in philosophy, I've been very interested in the concept of praxis for a long while, and yeah, I just thought it would be a very interesting exercise in thinking this notion of praxis among different traditions and how it can be applied in different contexts and so on. That's why I'm here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Carolyn Bellegarde.
Yeah, my name is Caroline. I'm from Copenhagen, Denmark, but I'm in Berlin, Germany now. And very simply for me, why I'm here is because I'm super interested in ways of challenging hegemonic knowledge hierarchies And for me, a part of this is the necessary part of knowing how, when I create knowledge, it's situated. And in this case, I thought this seminar would be super interesting because even when you read a lot of current philosophy like Donna Haraway and Jane Bennett, you don't necessarily get the clearness of how it's a Western thought that you're following. So that's why I'm here.
Wonderful, thank you. Feng Chiguo?
Yes, so I'm Finn, I'm Chinese, and currently I'm living in Beijing. And it's like 3:16 a.m. right now, so forgive me if I can't like speak up for the seminar, but I'll try to participate in the chats and also listening to all the comments. Upon practices, I'm planning to live and study in the temple in southern China starting in June. Honestly, I haven't really seriously studied Buddhism or Taoism, but I think, well, it's the right time for me to try to get into that. So, and also taking this course, I guess, is part of this process. Like pushing forward. So, yeah.
Wonderful, thank you. Jonathan?
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Jonathan. I'm right now in Richmond, Virginia. So I am an artist, mostly photography based, especially kind of experimental imaging technology. And I'm also a photography professor at a school here. So my primary reason, I guess, for being here, forgive me, is maybe to like siphon maybe some citations and some references, because I'm actively teaching undergrad and grad art students how to put into practice, queer feminist critical race theory, and I'm realizing in this task of, I'm lucky that I've been able to sort of craft my own courses, and I'm realizing that the labor of like decentering white authors and white kind of hegemonic sort of epistemics is really tremendous. And so I think I'm largely like being involved in the New Center, but also sort of knowing a little bit about your work. I was really interested in, getting pointers on how to sort of deal with affect, how to deal with all these things that I think artists deal with, but to have that kind of critical sort of inquiry in mind.
Wonderful, we'll have a lot to talk about. Agata?
Hi, I live in Mysłowice, Poland. I'm a visual artist, I'm mostly a painter, but I also do some collage and different kind of work. So I'm really looking forward for these classes. I was a little bit inspired to join the class because of my recent project, the Balance Workshop, that I led together with a friend who is living in Hong Kong. So yes, maybe that's all.
Thank you so much. Paige?
Hello, I am in Los Angeles, California, Tongvaland, and my interest lies in being an interdisciplinary artist, exploring the body, subjectivity, interactions, and especially with non-Western philosophies pertaining to how the self relates to its environment in an ecological standpoint. So yeah, very excited, thanks.
Wonderful, thank you. Alberto?
Hi, I'm originally from Caracas, Venezuela, but I am based in Berlin. My main interest is in writing and different explorations of into the materiality of writing, and also literary traditions and so on. And I have had like personal interest and engagement with traditions of Sazen and Taoism, but I have never really engaged in a seminar. So very excited about that. And also broadening the discourse of contemporary criticism and kind of seeing how this kind of dismantles or goes somewhere else. So really excited about joining the seminar. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Nick and Sani, I don't know if you're able to speak up. Oh, there you are, the video.
Hi, my name is Kensani. I'm a curator, researcher, and artist from Johannesburg, South Africa. My focus is mainly on indigenous cosmogonies and cosmologies and knowledge systems, and how we can basically translate those into contemporary art spaces. Yeah, so I'm joining this seminar because I think like I live in a radically alienated space from the East, and I think it would be interesting to even have a comparative lens, yeah, to find things that are similar and things that are different, and yeah, acquire new tools. I'm happy to see you all. Thank you for having me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Sebastian?
Hey, everyone. I'm Sebastian. I'm a writer and editor also in Berlin, based in Berlin, Germany, but I'm from Slovenia. My background is in art history and some philosophy and aesthetics. And yeah, I'm interested in how some, let's say, post-structuralist theories can be interpreted in a more materialist or material way. And I thought many of the readings from some of the readings from the syllabus touched upon this as well, and also materiality of language in general. Yeah, and I also think, as some other people already said, that we can learn, that there's a lot to be learned from Eastern cosmologies and indigenous epistemologies. And I also think I would add, especially in relation to technology, perhaps. Yeah, so that's me. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Shu Sao-mo, I don't know if you're able to.
Yes, I'm sorry that my internet is limited here. I am living in a Bedouin camp in St. Catherine and South Sinai, and I am originally from China. I have a background in continental philosophy and arts, public art. And my interest in the class, I guess, came from practices of Taoism in Xi'an, in also in a couple places in Southeast Asia, and also introduction into Taoist philosophy through psychoanalysis by of family constellation by Bert Hellinger, and so I feel very much caught in the space of a lot of things lost in translation. You know, here, you know, practically speaking, like I don't speak Arabic, and the Bedouin language is very unfamiliar to me. So on a day-to-day basis, I experience kind of events and situations that led me to kind of really question realities as had been, you know, previously defined. So yeah, so very happy to be here.
Thank you so much. And Shilpi, are you able to? Hello?
Hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm Shilpi. I'm based in Delhi, India, and I'm a designer working in the social impact sector. So I was practicing Nichiren Buddhism for many years, and recently, due to some unfortunate incidents, I've stopped practicing it. But mythologies and various practices of Hinduism and Buddhism, they introduce a lot of ideas, and I've been curious about how they relate to our current context and for the future. And the description of the seminar really excited me. So yeah.
Thank you everyone so much. Vincent, I believe that was everyone, correct? Okay.
Yeah, so
Okay, great. You know, honestly, if I had the power to handpick 17 people from the world, I mean, I think it would be us right here. I'm super excited to hear that there's so much convergence and shared interests, but from very diverse places. And clearly everyone has other things to bring together. So I think this will be really productive. And I think this encourages me to be somewhat free and maybe go a few places I always wonder if I should go. So I think we'll just go for it and see what happens. All right, so I'm going to launch right in. I will try to give us a small break at the halfway point, but I often forget. So maybe Vincent or anyone, if you need to like a break, you can let us know, or you can just come and go freely, frankly. I think that will be fine. All right, so you have the syllabus, and I'm going to present some of this material. And I didn't really ask you to do anything before coming today, because I think you need to see the framework to even know like which part of your brain to use to engage with some of the readings. And I think this class will be most interesting if it isn't so syllabus oriented, but if there's quite a bit of space to engage examples, objects, situations that are very real in our life, and to generate our own questions. So I hope we can be quite discussion driven, actually. I'm quite excited about that. I may prepare less for next time, but I will share a little bit of what I've prepared. Before I launch in, I'll just say that the kind of 4 sections into which I've organized our class, the Eastern Praxis bit, and the sort of space of broader discourse, whether it's translation or maybe critical theory of different kinds or situational, etc. And then the art, and then the more kind of practicum section, that all of these are, I see them really as layered one on top of each other. So I invite you in any given moment to engage it somewhat tentatively, and to maybe wait and see how it interacts with other layers, which is a little bit different than how we usually read. We tend to read an article deeply, kind of immediately we go deep in. You want to know something about the historical context, the author, the contemporary issues, further readings, commentary, and we have a usually well-trained way of engaging text. But in some ways, especially this week, in a lateral way, I'm going to invite you to kind of shuffle these pieces over and against each other. All right, that said, I will go back to my slides. By the way, the PowerPoint, the Google Slides that I will share in class, I will share the link with you. So there's no need to write anything down or fuss with that. Everything on the slides, all the quotations, all the links, you will have access to, and I'll invite you to add to it yourself. So feel free to, not worry about that part of it. Okay. Okay, so I will focus just on these 2 texts initially. We're definitely going to be talking about translating subjectivity pretty much at every point. But these 2 terms, especially the term subjectivity, may very quickly kind of blink in and out of our discourse. 2, the expressiveness of the body is really quite central to how I am talking not only about the sort of embodied aesthetic experiences, which I'll get to at the end of today, but even the way we engage practices of reading, writing, thinking, conversing, all as having something to do with this expressiveness of the body. Okay, so I'm just going to jump right in. These are readings you have available to you, and I'm only going to highlight one particular strain out of this piece. This is from chapter 4. the one that I find most relevant for us. And it may initially look like a fairly familiar kind of critique, and it is that too, but I'm going to take it in a different direction. So feel free to just creatively free associate if you like, just while I point out a few points. So, okay, the problem of theory in Asian studies. It's not the best phrase in some ways, but on another sense, it could include everything all of us have said about why we're here. We might just find ourselves in this little bucket. And the main thing that Sakai wants to point out is that this is a political question. And he means that in a very concrete, explicit sense, in terms of the institutions. And the institution of Asian studies in places like the United States is still very much operative today. It has quite deep ties to military, to government, to area studies, a lot of Cold War investment in those areas. The phenomenon of international students to the US is also very much something that Sakai is thinking about. He's at Cornell, and there are many international students who come to study Asian studies, not only from Asia, but from other places. And he suggests that to be a student of Asian studies already puts one in a strangely liminal position. And I think we're all there in some sense. And one thing is just to recognize that whether we like it or not, there is a history of social antagonism that in some way or another we have to address. We don't necessarily have to repeat it, enter into it, reproduce it, but we have to sort of be aware of it so that we're not actually repressing this dimension of the situation. And I think it goes a little beyond simply pointing out that, as a lot of you pointed out, the ongoing problem of the canon and the difficulties of simply diversifying authors that are read. This is actually talking a little more institutionally and social antagonism in that sense. Okay. So cultural difference. I just want to begin by talking about this concept and specifically the way Sakai defines it, I find really interesting for our purposes. So one, okay, cultural difference as it's encountered versus cultural difference as it is described. This is really two different things, okay? So think about your experience of cultural difference. It could be you walked into a restaurant you've never been to and you notice some kind of spice you've never smelled before. And you might think, oh, this is cultural difference. Now, he's pointing out that actually we often think that we experience cultural difference in an immediate experiential way, and then we have thoughts about it, but he's saying that isn't so. So it does not correspond to the distinction between primary or primordial perception and its secondary representation. So he's saying there is no such thing as a primary perception of cultural difference. There's primary perception, but it isn't of cultural difference. It's just perception. When it becomes cultural difference is always not simply a matter of describing our experience as such, but of creating, and this is the institutional and the social antagonism bit, it is of creating an object of knowledge that operates in the role of cultural difference. And until you do that first, right, unless you already have operating within yourself a conceptual layer where this notion of cultural difference operates, you can't actually perceive cultural difference. I'll just pause there. It seems kind of an obvious point, but it'll be really important in order to think some things that will come later about, I'll call it Buddhism, but about Dzogchen. So again, it's interesting. In his critique of cultural difference, the analogy Sakai points to is that between primary perception, whatever that is to you, living, thinking, feeling, breathing, being a body, is it a space of freedom? Is it intimate? Is it subjective? Whatever that is, and then the space of representation. And we often think that's how cultural difference operates, as if it has a primary part. But he points out, I'm sorry to belabor this, but hopefully it'll make things so simple later. But as he points out, you have to first determine it as an object of a certain kind of signification. So, pre-determining the object of cultural difference as such, what do you have? You could have an unobjectifiable feeling of, let's say, anxiety or the uncanny. He also makes a point of saying it's usually not going to come in the form of interesting, sweet, funny, pleasurable. It's more likely to be anxious or uncanny because it's really at the threshold of the sphere of affects that we acknowledge and are able to recognize as a part of our world, as a part of how we make sense of the world. So the things that touch it but aren't in it and aren't out of it, right? Out of it, you don't notice, totally blind. In it, you know it, you recognize it. Something at the threshold, right? You know it just enough to know it's culturally different. Before cultural difference, there might have been this little moment of anxiety or the uncanny. So that's a very important kind of experience to use to track within oneself where this might be happening. And this is very much a kind of meditative practice, actually, to work to reverse engineer from one's affects, not to, let's say, build on them, right? I have, like, think of how racial profiling works. You have some sensory perception. There's like a little something, you don't know what it is, so you will quickly overlay and overdetermine signification, right? And then act. So we're going in the opposite direction, actually. There's a little kind of affective experience, and we're kind of curious in going backwards. Okay, what happens if you go forward towards articulating and enunciating? Enunciating seems important. It's not just that you find a word that means something like the feeling. It means you're in a place and you're a person and you're speaking, like we just introduced ourselves, and we articulate in that very grounded place of encounter, of contact. And in doing so, okay, here's what's very interesting. The actual affect itself, this sort of anxious or uncanny feeling, is repressed. And at that point can be used, you could say, as a place on which to determine cultural difference. So much is happening, in other words, before we can think cultural difference. It's not a hard concept. It's, you know, kindergartners really get it. But what is it they're getting? It's an interesting question. By the time we think cultural difference is something that's identifiable between recognized and labeled entities, we are already so far away from the place where something, now this is not Sakai, this is just me, where we're actually really interested in. So I'm gonna invite you not so much to go towards this identifiable difference between entities, right? This is needed if, I don't know, if you live in New York every weekend, well, pre-COVID, there used to be some kind of cultural parade. How do you schedule all those parades and know who needs a slot? Well, you need to define those entities and then you can parade cultural difference, as it were. We're the anti-cultural parade direction. We're kind of curious to know how to move, how to even notice, recognize affect at this level, and then how to do something different with it. Okay, so I really love Sakai's language here. In the process of signification, and I invite you, a lot of your writers, artists, thinkers, researchers, we are all engaged in processes of signification. Now, we're gonna kind of contemplate how this process of signification itself might look differently, okay? But for now, let's contemplate, even in a very conventional kind of normative sense, when we signify cultural difference, what we're doing is arresting. I like this word, arresting. Like, it kind of speaks to Althusser's image of interpolation, right? Or Frantz Fanon talking about it in the colonial context, like, hey, you're hailed on the street and you turn because you know you're guilty before you know you did anything, because that's how identification works. So what if, rather than that hailing that leads to an arrest, what if you could arrest in yourself something at the moment of a practical non-synchronic encounter? Now, here, what signification does is stop the affect, start the signification, right? You stop someone on the street and you layer the signification onto them. You label them, you identify them, all the stereotypes come up, all the ways in which we don't have to think, because signification is very thick in our social spaces. All of that happens, right? Now, what if we were to arrest this arrest, is what I want you to consider. And then here, again, these languages are so, you can easily appropriate them and turn them into a dual direction, kind of a dual trajectory. So what if you, okay, in this case, the person who is trying to arrest the affect and let it stand, one gazes at it, contemplates it, and the key point here is recognize, and I would add identify, and therefore one becomes, in front of this object of study, the epistemic subject. It's really powerful. There's a reason why it feels good to take something that feels uncomfortable, to look at it, to arrest it, and then to know it. Just to recap, cultural difference is never given in and of itself, right? You can disagree, we'll talk in a minute, but as far as Sakai's argument goes, cultural difference is not given in and of itself. What's given is, right, is this, okay? And what does this mean if we accept his thesis here? It means then that we have to abandon something more than an idea or our perceptions. We actually have to abandon the premise of society as a completely or fully constituted cultural unity, which then can have differences between them, so that the liminality is just a space between two fully constituted cultural and unities. Sakai is saying, no, that's not actually where the in-between lies. The in-between lies somewhere else. It's almost like it lies under. It's more like an underlying layer onto which we arrest, and then the process of signification constitutes a mapping of the world. And in sum, I thought this question might be useful because I think we all will recognize this question. Whenever anyone problematizes the question of cultural difference, sometimes, we feel, well, okay, this is too hard or too complicated. Should I just stick to, should I just go home, right? I live in the US, so there's always this possibility in people's minds that these immigrants could just go home somehow. Like who it doesn't really matter if home is like 5 generations ago and so on. So it's that kind of idea here. Like, should we just stick to what we know? This is identity politics in its most limiting and self-censoring and kind of micro-fascistic form, that you speak for yourself, that you speak for whatever you have the right to speak for. And that will become complicated for us because hopefully before our time is up, we will not feel that even our self is such an obviously owned piece of private property. So now Sakai is saying, look, sometimes this gesture to the local looks like a gesture of modesty, right? But he's saying the problem with this gesture of modesty isn't the modesty bit. That's fine, a good impulse. However, the problem is that what does it actually effectively do? It again covers over, represses, eradicates the antagonistic nature of the practice of Asian studies. And so in the name of the local, we often simply sidestep the reality of contact. And it's not simply colonial history itself. I really feel it's ongoing, pervasive, and everywhere. the notion of an encounter, even with one's own sensations. Okay. So, oh, sorry, I had one more. Okay, I think I can skip. Okay, I'll not skip that one. Okay, and in sum, what is to be gained? What is to be gained if we accept Sakai's notion that cultural difference is not a given? Well, from that premise, what happens is any act of translation and subjectivity is also something else. Once you recognize that as necessarily a political problem, then that engaging in translation of subjectivity is also always a political action. And it participates in the formation of new political collectives or the alteration of existing social relations. Because translation is never just translation, and subjectivity is also never assumed. So I'll pause there, just curious if anyone has responses, comments, free association. I could also just continue a bit. Shall I continue a bit? All right. Okay, so far so good. Just briefly on the terrain of analysis, I don't know if you are all familiar with this piece, but this is a website or a terrain of analysis offered by Anna Singh. Probably you know Anna Singh, a well-known anthropologist who's been very curious about how do you do anthropology beyond the human, multi-species, oh, it says here, more than human Anthropocene. So she calls it a feral atlas. So I think a feral atlas really resonates with Sakai's notion of non-aggregate communities addressed by a kind of, you could say, a work on cultural difference based on the premise that cultural difference is never given. Okay, so in this piece, I'll just click a few places. So people have tried to envision why does it matter, and I guess I'll just leave it a question, does it matter to change the interface, right? Is this just a matter of, oh, we're adding a layer of art, or does it fundamentally change our encounter with the concepts, right? That you have this. I'll let you all play around with this, but I'll just click a few things. It invites us, I think, always to consider, even if it's really simple, in this way, the terrain, right? Before I go and find the red dot and click on it, it invites you to consider the terrain of research, of contemplation, of discourse, even of our looking at this website. So if we read this not as a figure of the idea of the non-human, but as an interface inviting us to contemplate more. In other words, to give us more things to have sensory affects around in terms of our encounter with the idea. In other words, you could open a book and for sure you're having an encounter with the idea, but this interface kind of necessitates, slows down, or adds thicker layers of sensory perceptions, right? Like I have a reaction to this image, which has nothing to do with dangerous waste, but it's an image and I have all kinds of sensory perceptions now that are waiting in the space of encounter with toxic waste. So that's a part of what this, I think this project does. Okay. All right, I'll move on. And then another example. Oh, I have this image actually in here, by the artist Samson Kambalu. This piece, I'm just showing you this, it's a more complex piece than I can really do justice here, but just this image, again, like Feral Atlas. I like this one because unlike sort of a more high-tech, clearly complexly created web interface, but this too is a different kind of interface and really thinks through a space of encounter. It's not simply that you will see videos, images, and contemplate Malawi, UK, US in this space of encounter. It also invites you then to use kinesthetic experiences, walk over these wires and around these little plywood boxes and have that kinesthetic sensory data participate in your receiving of, it could be anxiety, it could be uncanny, it could be knowledge. Certain people will know a lot about these images, some people might know nothing. All of that layering in this non-aggregate community joins with a shared physical experience, right? This is what a lot of installation art works at. It's not always articulated, and I'm inviting us to articulate these kind of experiences as a part of the theorization around art and culture. So I invite you to contemplate Samson Kambalu's installation here in this image, and even us who are only experiencing this as a digital image, it draws on your deep experiences of, I don't know, of wires, of moving around in a space, of navigating. And part of those kind of memory reserves are very much determine the aesthetic experience, but in fact is usually excluded completely from discourses about the aesthetic experience. And so we would have to say what we want to say through cultural difference, right? We would have to make everything. So the notion of a particular kind of personal multi-location history would have to hold the weight of all the complexities of the affects that we might want to articulate. I think it's asking identity to do too much work, in fact. Okay, stop. All right, I'll pause for a moment there. Any comments about any of these examples so far? Okay. I guess I'll continue. Feel free to just raise hand function or do anything if you'd like to jump in here and pull things in other directions. Okay.
I just wanted to add, yeah, I thought it was really interesting what you said about cultural difference and it's not being firmly fixed, but always also performative. And I also thought maybe we could think of a temporal aspect of it and how it needs to be continuously reinstated in order to be productive, right? So it's not just like a one-time phenomenon. Yeah, just a comment.
Yeah, thanks for that comment. The temporal dimension, and specifically, I love that you use the word repeating, that it must repeatedly be brought forth, because that is the fundamental definition of any kind of practice. It isn't a practice if there isn't an element of repetition. So yes, the temporal dimension altogether, historical, nonlinear historicity, multi-species, which already changes the temporality, all of that, as Sebastian pointed out, but then also the repetition specifically as practice, with a C. We'll get to praxis in a bit. So just something one practices, right? Praxis is a stronger sense of something actually transformative or fully actualizing the potential. And a practice might be done even futilely, but it does repeat and always uses the temporal dimension to investigate something, right? So it's a little different from how we think of a relationship to the conceptual. Okay, thank you so much. All right, now, oh yes, Andrew.
So I was kind of thinking about this relating to some of my personal bugbears involving things like canonicity and kind of what I mentioned about how hard of a purchase it is to get into these sorts of other traditions of thought. Kind of relating to the idea of cultural difference, is it also, in addition to arresting the subject into an object upon which we then overlay these significations and then reify these relationships and all that, it also calcifies and makes impossible certain movements. So to use a kind of very trite example, for instance, in my own kind of particular modality of what you can see who I am in this case, in these sort of regiments of knowledge transmission, let's just say, teaching, let's go with that. for instance, I cannot be, say, a student of Lao Tzu, in a sense. I cannot read them in a way that I can say I'm a student in this sort of more direct way. There's always the kind of question of appropriation, gentrification, and all that sort of thing. So while I don't quite know what else to go through from that, but I want to kind of throw that little spike in there just to kind of give an idea of how these sorts of mechanisms can also potentially affect, and see what y'all think about that.
Yeah, anyone else want to respond? It's a really interesting question.
I guess like I'm still thinking about like the idea of temporality and how time, for example, exists in the Bantu Congo cosmogony as a non-linear kind of modality, but a circular modality, right? And even the dimensionality of time is sort of thought of differently, in the sense that you get the cosmogram, which is called Dikenga in the Bantu languages. And it has like 4 stages, you know, and sort of like the first stage is birth, the second stage is life, the third stage is death, and then the 4th stage is rebirth. And it's a cycle. And it, you know, and it's sort of like there's no real separation between the physical realm and the spiritual realm. They all exist within. So it's sort of like time exists also in the spiritual realm, you know. So I guess like I just wanted to throw this in there just to kind of complicate things and bring a different perspective of thinking about time and linearity and how we experience time. You know, how like there's no one way of experiencing time. Yeah, that's my 2 cents.
That's a great complication, because like, let's put that next to what Andrew was saying about appropriation, right? This really changes how we think of what things have to be stabilized or rested in order for appropriation to be successful. Like, let's just, little devil's advocate. I am trying very hard to appropriate, right, this other culture. What kind of timeline is necessary in order for that to happen? What Kensani is saying about the nonlinear cosmology with those 4, and the 4th is rebirth. It's kind of hard to track your appropriations, even in a way. Or I wonder if it's the problem that we all intuitively know exists. You know, it's going to be okay. We're headed to the Dzogchen in a bit, but in a way, well, the negation and resistance part, we'll have that discussion next week. But for now, this question of appropriation usually has to do with like, where are the proper borders, right? And to know where the proper borders are, especially in time, is really interesting, because we do identity politics in a one lifetime model. Identity politics itself looks really different in a multiple lifetime model, or if time really is cyclical and understood as nonlinear, not just a return to some kind of mythic status. Like, there's certain terms we use to understand the power dynamics among cultures that themselves might need to change. So I think this is a great question. Let's see if we want to, I don't know, Andrew, I'm thinking like, what if we redescribed what is occurring under the sign of appropriation itself? I wonder if that's a contemplation, one of the contemplations we can hold. Okay, I'll go on a bit and then let's talk about this some more. This is getting very interesting. Okay. So now let's turn from Sakai's terrain of analysis, and we'll come back to terrain later when we look at Taoism. But for now, let's turn to the body with Kuriyama's book. And from terrain, let's think a different kind of terrain. And I just kind of reduced a really beautifully, like, really long but well-written book into a couple slides. So I'm just gonna do this very reductively. like Greek Chinese. And I just will remind you that at this time, like 300 BC, in terms of actual medical practice, diagnosis and treatment, effective diagnosis, successful treatment, the Chinese, Indian medicine, pretty much everybody outside of the Greeks were much more advanced, actually, as Kuriyama will tell you in more historical terms. And the Greeks were really different. And people think, oh, they're different because we can see the roots of contemporary surgery and modern science. We imagine that those differences emerged out of practical necessity. But in fact, Kuriyama will point out, there was no practical basis for certain Greek notions about the body and about medicine. In fact, they were driven more by the metaphysics. So let's take the pulse. Very simple one. The pulse exists for the Greeks only in the heart and arteries, whereas palpitation, spasm, and tremor are in the muscles and nerves. Okay, this division was quite an accomplishment, and there's a history to how this came about. Once this came about, everything became very simple. But this division really never happened in many other parts of the world. So for example, Chinese palpitation wasn't based on, wasn't based on the imagination of the dilating and contracting artery. The mo was not the pulse in that sense. I'm just going to keep calling it all the pulse just to make it simple. So if this Chinese version of pulse is the language of life, its grammar was topological. So I just want to ask right now, what goes into a perceptual style? On the one hand, the pulse of the arteries and heart versus this topological, right, touching of, I don't know, the wrist, okay? Very similar to Sakai, Kuriyama points out there's a gap between touching and feeling. And again, perceptions are not raw experiences. This is an interesting recurring note, that perceptions aren't raw experiences. What is a rough mo? Doctors in China seemed content to say it's like sawing bamboo, or it's like rain-soaked sand. To Western pulse takers, these don't count as proper answers, right? It's not that it's not like sawing bamboo, it's like sawing oak. That's not the point. It's not a truth-false evaluation. It's an evaluation of the form. The form is actually wrong. So you might think this is how cultural difference works actually, right? Contestations over form rather than truth per se. But I think it's maybe a little more than that. Now, Kuriyama will point out, okay, the pulse taking, once the Greeks kind of succeed in defining anatomy in a particular way, becomes a shriveled, meager science, mostly the bare counting of beats. But the bare counting of beats with digital technology is very powerful. So very interesting divergence here, a huge, huge divergence, but it's not forever divergence, right? Because in fact, things are nonlinear and digital technology is everywhere. So anyway, just wanna point out this. And then the next point, okay, so this was about the pulse, which is related to muscles, as you'll see, because the muscles and the arteries in heart have different functions and are now anatomically distinct categories. It isn't so with mo, right, the Chinese pulse. Okay. In the West then, or in Greece, in ancient Greece, the vision of muscularity was again somewhat exceptional. And as Kuriyama points out, there's nothing matter of fact about seeing muscles. Today, it's really hard, probably for all of us here, to not see a muscle. But in fact, what we're seeing is a total mental projection. He says, well, go to a summer beach. I don't know, it depends on what your beach looks like probably. But for Kuriyama, most muscles on most people is not obviously seen. And in an art class, people say it's quite an advanced skill to actually envision musculature. It isn't what intuitively most people like see. And Galen, another important scholar, you can read it in the book, says that it takes incredible training and experience to actually see something more than a cadaver. So to see anatomy is also a mystery. Okay, so the Europeans who encountered these incredible Chinese medical texts, which they were very excited about translating because the efficacy of Chinese medicine was astonishing in Europe at this time. So it was astonishing, but the language was just poetry. It made no sense as science. Now, musculature is also a mystery, Kriyama is pointing out. It's quite a mystery. So I invite you to discover where in your experience it's still a mystery. And the interest in muscularity is connected to preoccupation with the agency of the self. In fact, habitual mobility, something as simple as being able to know how to use your body, is in this Greek context proof that another force is also at work, meaning psychic power, meaning the soul. So musculature and seeing anatomy was very much part of a metaphysics. I just thought it might be fun here to look at Instagram. Social media as a strange also form of topology and a terrain of analysis. And this is Jennifer Roberts' account. Jennifer Roberts is an art historian at Harvard. And she posted this image. I invite you to look at this. I picked it because I was just curious what you would think it looks like to you. And I'll just read what Jennifer Roberts has to say. These made me think about what it would be like to have a body like this, to be a double-sided surface, to have a spine and flesh and veins, but nothing like an interior. There would be no room for secrets, nowhere to hide. You couldn't even turn away, that quintessential human gesture of refusal and abandonment, because the figures on your front pass through to your back, so you would always be exposed. In order to live by the ethics of leaves, one would have to let oneself be traversed by all things, and to have a cosmology that would be like a pneumatology, one based on breathing in the world. And then she goes on to contemplate mammalian circulation next to plant capillary structure and hydrostatic principles. Okay. So I guess what I'm posing here for your contemplation is these sort of multiple layers of cultural difference, and to contemplate what happens to our thinking when we start considering not simply the counting of beats, which has its own temporality, right? The metronome, it has a very metric kind of rhythm. There are certain ways one invents devices to capture that. Possibly, if the ancient Chinese were inventing devices first, might have created different kind of devices, who knows? Definitely in terms of aesthetic form, which has to play a part somewhere between concept and manufacturing. The design of things would be affected by different kinds of philosophical viewpoints. So any comments here? I'll just pause. Okay, I'll continue then. All right. Oops. Okay. And one more about the gap between touching and feeling. I think I have an image. So I don't know if you're all familiar with this. It's pretty well known. Renato Liata's work here. These are tiles that, when soft, the artist placed beneath citrus trees in an orchard, and lemons dropped onto the soft clay and indented them. And then he has, you know, kind of created this topological surface out of those tiles. And you can see the indentations left by the lemons. So given the question of agency and time and topology and surface, this image for me speaks to a different kind of time and natural process, right? Literally, not just the tree, there's the tree creating the lemons, which have to ripen at a certain moment. And then there's the action of gravity, which is the direct, you could say, agent of pulling the lemon onto the tile. And then there's sort of the ongoing sun, which is here used not to mark a certain kind of time, but actually to also provide heat and facilitate the alchemical dimension of the making of these tiles. Okay. Just pause for a second. Anybody want to put some of this stuff together, or is anything linking up a little bit? Any resonances you notice, or things that connect to, I don't know, things on your mind? I'll just take a beat. Okay, I'll let you keep thinking. I'll do the last section on, I think we need to get to Longchenpa now in the Dzogchen, and then pull it together. And maybe we'll pause and just have a discussion about everything. And I would also like for us to do just a little bit of an exercise. Okay. All right, so I shall continue. Okay, you know, I thought for a very long time about how to make this really, really brief and simple. And that's not just my own ambition. It's actually a part of the tradition, the pith instruction. The pith instruction is really valued. The 3-sentence instruction that kind of takes you right to it. Like the haiku, or a very short story, or the way an image flashes by. And I think the pith is really interesting, given what Sakai said earlier about what happens before cultural difference appears. And I'm sort of interested, not so much in doing anything to cultural difference after it appears, but sort of interested in expanding the terrain, making it bigger, or like zooming in, more detail, more tactility, the space before it appears. So not the negation of cultural difference, not something else. I'm actually very interested in what leads to cultural difference, but what happens before that concept forms. Because that's a very interesting place from which then to, I need to offer you, right, a translation point from which to enter into this. So we don't randomly, we're not in the swimming pool of appropriation. So I'm giving you a very particular place, like a little plank to walk through Sakai, through Kriyama, through some art into Longchenpa. I'm going to save the more biographical discussion, historical discussion of this person as a historical figure for next week, which will get a little more into the notion of praxis and look specifically at how that practice works and do a little bit of comparative discussion of that with other forms of negation. But for today, I'm going to attempt to just give you a bit of a pith delivery of Dzogchen, the great perfection. Interestingly enough, I feel it is allowed to do this, you could say, in that unlike other vast archives of Buddhist thought and Bön thought and Taoist thought around meditative practice, Dzogchen in particular, in its content, in its central ideas, really champions the direct transmission and really champions spontaneity, and is of, I think, all the kind of sects within a big playing field, the most anti-doctrinal and the most anti-canonical and anti-dogmatic in many ways. So I'll talk about that more next week. So these are really quite basic, but I think it would be, I don't want to make it appear that these are universal or universally assumed or commonly held beliefs by people who meditate, Buddhist or otherwise. However, they are presented as such, and it is important to kind of know that. This is from Longchenpa's own auto-commentary on this book. The primary text is sort of in verse form, and I'll make it available if you're interested, but I wanted to give you more of the commentary first because I think it's easier for us to enter into commentary language than the direct pith transmission, because these address practitioners, and I don't know that that's exactly whom we are. So in the auto commentary, these are the subtitles of the sections of the reading I've offered, and I'll just kind of talk about a few basic ideas. The first one, I think the title is all you need. We can talk more about that, but that's the first concept, that phenomena is mind, okay? Meaning there is no, so in one fell swoop, we are sidestepping empiricism. We are very interested in new materialism, vital materialism. We're interested in materialization altogether, but empiricism, not so much. Like in a way, if you've gotten to this point, and this is not the beginning, obviously, of this path or this philosophical view, but if you've gotten to this point, you've already left certain kinds of empiricism behind. And then let's go on. Okay, so the knower of the object in the first moment of cognizing something as this or that is called mind. This is a little bit of a definition. I just want you to note, it's called mind, it's not called subject. It's not called, this is not subjectivity, but I think it comes closest to what we actually call, you know, in the Western Academy, subjectivity. But this is called mind. It's the knower of the object. But because it's called mind, it's important not to translate this as the subject. We're already, in order to begin it all, that's why I had a very long, slow intro, you have to be able to begin without the subject. So translation and subjectivity. The first translation we're doing is, we're just sort of leaping into a space without subject. There will be a self, but there's no subject here. Okay, or I choose not to translate subject into some of these words. In Sakai's piece, that's the whole point of that piece I shared with you. How do you translate the word subject into Japanese? And there's two ways to do it, the epistemic subject and the subject of practice. Now here, we're gonna go with mind. Now, this first moment of cognizing, I invite you to connect this to what Sakai was saying happens before cultural difference, what Kuriyama was talking about as what you're actually touching. Okay. When the perceiving cognitions that vividly and in an instant issue from the different sense doors. Okay, let's just pause for a minute. The sense doors, meaning sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, the 5 sense perceptions. Okay, those are called doors. It's, I think, a common expression now, right? The gate, in the 60s, people always refer like mind-altering drugs, the gateway of perception. It's kind of the same thing, that the senses are considered doors, gateways. And there is a kind of first moment, and then there is a second moment. And these stages are really important because how you understand what happens at each stage and how they sequence, all of that taken together is something like the definition of the self, or what we would call subjectivity, or even phenomenology, right? If whether you're thinking, what is the nature of experience? What is the nature of perception? What is the nature of being able to think and articulate from the position of the I? All of these have a very different kind of look and feel to it. So the form may feel wrong to you here. Okay. Now, what we do is we have a cognition And then, well, we, meaning mind, then has a bit of a reaction. It's either pleasant or unpleasant or neither, like it's indifferent. So these are the three poisons: attachment, aversion, and ignorance. And out of that, in this particular worldview, arises all of the delusionary aspects of the world. But delusion sounds a bit too, I think, psychological. I think it really corresponds to what in Marxist theory we call reification, or ideology even, or consensus reality, or even normative reality. How do those things arise and constantly, right? Repeat, re-arise, recaptured. The fact that it says in an instant is important. It can only last for an instant. It's very important to know this doesn't have longer duration. And so, of course, in a more monastic tradition, entire societies, social worlds are built around controlling the doors of perception, closing the doors of perception. But Dzogchen will take a different path. And for me, this is why I find Dzogchen very relevant today. Given the contemporary situation, which I'll talk about in week 3, especially around technology and how that has affected transnational governmentality, it seems to me that a 20th century political activism that needs a certain notion of agency and that needs to articulate resistance, subversion, opting out. I feel like that language doesn't always apprehend so well or give us more to work with in terms of our current reality. So I'm interested in Dzogchen at the moment when it, in a way you could say, or within Buddhism altogether, like tantric practices that diverge from a more monastic situation, right? That's a very particular kind of social and political organization around a worldview. And so here, that's, there's a lot to read into in this phrase. Okay, I'll continue. Back to mind. So mind, if you remember, mind was the knower, right, of whatever is known. It cognizes, but knowledge is broken up into a few pieces. Knowledge doesn't mean already, all at once, there's subject and object. No, there's a first moment of cognizing where there isn't necessarily all of that. And then there are secondary and tertiary layers. So here, the mind is the consciousness of the universal ground. Universal ground refers to what you might know as karma or history or the persistence of false ideas like racism. Like, where do these delusionary things live? Where do they constantly reappear out of? It's a kind of universal ground. The clinging to that ground is self, and that's what's called the intellect. Okay, now, if we are free of concepts, okay, remember where they came up? Concept came up where? Right here, after this instant. Okay, let's say that didn't happen. And one rests in the fundamental nature. Okay, so maybe you just sort of stay in this ground, even though it's a pretty messy place with some questionable things in it. Let's say one can rest there. We're going to have to talk about rest for a whole week. Even though appearing sense objects are perceived distinctly, one does not speak of mind, intellect, and consciousness, for there is no apprehension of dual appearance. There is no apprehended object and no apprehending mind. Okay, so we all know you can't really negate duality out of existence because that's a very dualistic endeavor. But look, you can just go to a moment before duality and stay there. It's really simple. Dzogchen is really simple. It's kind of impossible, but it's very simple. So in this moment free of conception, in this moment prior to cultural difference, in fact, okay, this is a very strange philosophy. Imagine the Greeks encountering you know, like, what is your diastolic, systolic blood pressure, right? And they're reading these Chinese texts by like really, really profoundly talented doctors who are saying, oh, this pulse is like sawing through bamboo. Okay, this is the moment we're having. So in this philosophical system, sometimes concepts exist and sometimes the same concepts do not exist. This is a very, very strange and unusual situation, and I can't make it seem less strange than it is. It's like certain meridians. If you know acupuncture and Chinese traditional medicine, you know there are meridians in the body, right? It's a whole network. That's not hard to imagine. Topology, right? In the art examples, we could easily imagine things like that, website interfaces and so on. However, what do you do with the fact that sometimes there's certain meridians, like there's like a fire meridian at the center of the body, sometimes it's there and sometimes it's not. How do you deal with a philosophical system in which certain concepts are sometimes there and sometimes not? You know, even someone like Baruch Spinoza, whom I feel comes very close, like he's like, you know, like 3 inches away from Eastern philosophy. Still, he has to work with the best he's got, the geometric method. You still establish certain definitions. Those definitions remain constant. The notion of a constant is how science works. If you don't have a controlled experiment, it's not an experiment. It's just, I don't know, performance art, right? So what do you do with a philosophical system that refuses fundamentally, that's its whole point, to maintain constant definitions and concepts? But in fact, it's not that it's all fuzzy and murky and anything goes. No, it's very precise. You can diagnose and you can treat, and you can live a life with this and you can make sense of your world. People have done so and levitated and all sorts of things. So this concept, mind, intellect, and consciousness, sometimes do not even appear at all. Duality does not even appear at all. And then sometimes, of course, it absolutely does appear. Okay, so this is the kind of strange point of Longchenpa. But if you layer this on top of Kuriyama and Sakai, I hope it will be somewhat simple. Okay, I'll just continue. I don't have a lot more. The consciousness of the universal ground. All right, what is consciousness of the universal ground? Remember, it was that place where all this, oh, I'm going the wrong way. Now I have lost my linear progression. Okay, back. All right, let's go back. Okay, so here we were, mind, right? First moment of cognizing. And then we have, right in an instant after the vivid, we actually have examination of what has appeared and take it to be. There's some evaluation. This is, you could say, the moment of Kant. This is aesthetic judgment. Okay, and then stop. This consciousness of the universal ground is mind. So if you wanted to know what was it, that was knowing the object. Like, what is it that knows what comes into the sensory doors? Well, it was consciousness of the universal ground. Okay, and what is that? Well, oops. It is that place where if one sort of stays there and doesn't bother to think, it is the basis of thinking, but if you use it not to think but to rest, then it's like a little choose your own adventure philosophical system. If you choose door on the left, boom, you're over here and you're just like hanging out with the Buddhas and the Dakinis. And then door on the right, you could, every instant of your life, repopulate the entire philosophical tradition, mind, intellect, consciousness, duality, subject, object. Then you can have cultural difference. Then you can have appropriation. Then you can have a lot of other things. But what if you rest and you stay in, now it's going to be given a different name. And you're wondering, where did this come from? Well, it just gets a new name. It's how the system works. It gets a different name if you take door to the left, which was resting. So now it's going to be called self-arisen. Self-arising shouldn't be hard. Even in Spinoza, nature is self-arising. Even in Instagram, we understand self-arising, right? We understand that there's a way in which one is creating and created at the same time. One is giving rise to oneself and one has been given rise to. And that kind of strange self-reflexive circuit is all over the internet. So this is very familiar, I think, self-arisen. Primordial wisdom of luminosity might be a little bit strange. And this primordial wisdom of luminosity is that consciousness of universal ground. However, when consciousness of universal ground rests for a bit, it wants to rename itself. It doesn't feel like it's consciousness of universal ground anymore. It actually starts to feel like primordial wisdom of luminosity that is empty by nature, luminous by character, and unceasing in its variously arising radiance. These are technical terms. Luminous, empty, and radiating are the words that describe that universal ground. If one stays long enough in door to the left, one stays long enough prior to duality. However, yet, what happens? Door to the right. Actually, we can't resist door to the right because, I don't know, how long can you take door to the left without sort of just looking to the right? And then what do we do? Well, you could just sort of fixate. Why not? It's free, it's spontaneous. That means there's no way to prevent ignorance. This is the thing. In a system 100% dedicated to spontaneous freedom, there is no way to prevent delusion. That's why coemergence. So what happens? Well, through fixation, subject and objects arise, and it is awareness. It's not anything else. It is actually this self-arisen primordial wisdom of luminosity, but it forgot its name. And now this awareness will turn through nothing more powerful than habit, repetition, entering into the heartbeat, right? A certain kind of temporality, like maybe I'm just my blood pressure. It will turn into ordinary mind. And it's this ordinary mind. I'm sorry, it's confusing because it's the same words appear many times. It's this ordinary mind, which then becomes self, becomes subject. But the name for subjectivity is, interestingly enough, you could say the cluster of affects that we think the self owns, right? There's a subject and the subject has its feelings, has its experiences, has its thoughts. And so here, the bundle of those things, the heaps of things, often called skandhas, those heaps of things, which are definitely a kind of aggregate of, kind of a loosely holding together aggregate of things, that is ordinary mind. It is the root of delusion. And it's nothing more than a side effect of clinging, that the appearance of stability and constancy then comes to feel, definitely feel real. And so this is the story in a nutshell of the kind of philosophical view that underlies meditation practice. Okay, now, right, oops. The failure to recognize is all you got to work with in terms of why do we go from self-arisen primordial wisdom of luminosity to the presidential elections, to climate change. Like, this is it. The failure to recognize awareness has to do a lot of work here in terms of the concept of what is the basis for the rising of something other than primordial wisdom from itself. All right, so the nature of the universal ground, the nature of that mind, of that consciousness, sometimes of that wisdom, when it's simply the ground of habitual tendencies, right? The ground of possibilities for the rising of that delusion is ignorance. And this is co-emergent ignorance. So it's never ignorance by itself. It's ignorance together with its buddy, which is, okay, here, co-emergent wisdom. These co-emerge. And only because of understanding and recognizing this co-emergence do not fall into dualism, interestingly enough. So that is not dualism. And it's only not dualism, not conceptually. Conceptually, of course, it is dualistic, but practically at the level of what one actually has experienced. So that's going to be tricky, like the whole question of where is evidence, what is verifiable, this will become a problem. But just to finish this up, so when the consciousness of the universal ground is sort of like leaning towards door left, it's simply clear, limpid state of cognition. There are no concepts there. There is no object, there is no subject. It's actually very simple. It's always there, it's always available. It's spontaneously there. It isn't determined, right? As an object of study, you have to determine an object of study first, then you can know it, thereby becoming the epistemic subject. But here, we're dealing with something so different, this clear and limpid state of cognition, which is a feeling. Either you know it or you don't. And you know it only, and this is not being touchy-feely. I hope it doesn't sound like I'm being touchy-feely, but it can only be felt. Why? Because it can never be an object of concept. That's it. And the five senses are actually not a problem. Sensing does not necessarily lead to concept or self even, which is so interesting because a self can only become a self by building on those senses, right? This is the coemergence. Okay, and this is the final point. What is enlightenment? Well, it's really simple. In the first moment, okay, mind knows its object, which is another way of seeing the eye sees what it sees, the hand feels what it feels. Even it's okay for a hand to touch another hand and feel that pulse and say, this sounds like the sign of bamboo. All of that much could be known without accumulating karma, without entering into delusion, without needing to become subjects and objects. And here's the pith. When consciousness of objects of the six sense powers are unspoiled by grasping, this is suchness. So that's it. That's fruition. Okay. I think I have gotten. Okay. Well, I see. I left out. I'll talk about this more when we talk about dream. But in case you're wondering, have I ever experienced that? Actually, as far as the theory goes, we're experiencing it now. It's constantly there. And there's a lot of discussion even in media studies. If anyone is interested in, Catherine Hales has written an interesting book about, what does she call it? I always get it's non-conscious cognition, or is it non-cognitive conscious? It's non-conscious cognition. Thinking about things like AI. AI operate as non-conscious, but very much cognitive. So there's an interesting point of comparison there, possibly. So this is the point at which we really probably all experience it and aren't even aware it's a thing, possibly, or maybe some of you are because you have even practiced this. But at the moment of sleep, there's a moment when your seventh consciousness, that's your five senses, the mind, that's like coordinates everything, and the seventh, which is sense of self, that all of these melt back, right, into the ground because they're consciousnesses. So when consciousness goes to sleep, as it were, what happens to all this stuff? They go back to the ground. And it's called purified, which is a tricky word. I'm going to ignore that for now. And actually, that's all it takes. When these consciousness go back, they go back to rest in that ground. That is coemergent wisdom. There's nothing else one does or no other place from which one can give rise to wisdom, because that would be deterministic. Wisdom is not determined as an object of knowledge or action or agency of a dualistic subject on its body, right? So even yogic practices are very, very useful, like Longchenpa, mostly the practice guidelines are about that. But at a certain point in Dzogchen, even those have to be let go, because there's ultimately nothing one can do to create an unconditioned, in other words, spontaneously self-liberated experience of mind as wisdom. And what is it you do? You recognize. That's it. So that's Dzogchen in a nutshell. I'm definitely going to pause there now. There's a lot of me talking. And let's just sort of pause. Maybe we take a 5-minute break. I think this might be a good point. And then let's come back and have some discussion about any of this. Also, feel free, because of how this kind of discussion of mind works, feel free to free associate and introduce some other things, because those will often be the way we find ourselves, where we need to go. Okay, so how about 5 minutes? I have 3:41, so I'll be back at 3:46. just realized there was a whole discussion happening in chat, so that's cool. Okay, so let's have some discussion. Feel free to really just say anything. It doesn't have to be directly related to what I presented. You'll have that available. You can look at it anytime. Paige.
I was just thinking, oh, by the way, I like your Spirited Away screensaver. When you were talking about Longchenpo's, like the cognitive space, I was kind of relating that to the other texts, like in Subjectivity and Translation, where like the point of translation is this point of disparity kind of, and then also with like expressiveness of the body, relating Chinese medicine to like the Tao Te Ching in defying articulation, and which is like being poetical around medicine could be like very frustrating, obviously, but I think it's like what I was like getting out of it is like keeping the senses open, opposed to like where this articulation brings in this like narrowness, and kind of like limiting on what you can perceive of what's going on in the body. But yeah, those are just like my thoughts on what you were just talking about.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Paige. Anyone else?
Can y'all hear me? Okay, cool. So I was kind of thinking more on the idea of the sort of coemergent phenomenon of awareness and wisdom, and kind of charting it in my head as like, okay, one of the things that it made me think about was like, okay, is this another sort of manifestation of mind-body dualism, like the mind-body dichotomy? Until I kind of went into the idea of, okay, so we have the universal ground, which could be, if we want to go down that path, another way of perhaps calling chaos. That instead of the mind and body being these sort of essential characteristics of the human subject, we can see the mind and body as, let's go Deleuze-Guattarian here, as machines that come out of chaos, out of the universal ground. And so they're less sort of aspects of the human body that are in contest with each other, but are instead sort of co-emergent phenomenon that are used as ways of charting the universal ground and making sort of articulable materials out of the universal ground, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, so interesting, your connections to chaos. It's interesting that, you know, a lot of Buddhist practitioner, teacher, scholars, the social role is a little bit different, but are actually quite open to, and like the Dalai Lama is very welcoming of these kind of translations to things like chaos theory or quantum physics. And this question of translation is really important because, as you can imagine, the way that the philosophy is able to protect its kind of kernel at the non-conceptual level, once we start conceptualizing, I mean, why not? Like, it's actually very open to that. I mean, it's like, you know, it isn't appropriation, for example, in that sense, because these translations to things like chaos, like, why would that be foreign, right? It could definitely be a natural contemporary expression out of that non-conceptual. And chaos, of course, plays a very similar role in its little local, right, epistemologies, the way it's affected literary study, as well as science, like so many different fields, language, behaviorism. It's actually a fundamental method that changes how you do things by altering the starting point. So it's very resonant. I like this connection very much. Jessica.
I just wanted to share, in the spirit of practice, the experience of thinking about these concepts from Dzogchen while being on Zoom and feeling inundated by these connectivity vibrations, and actually having an experience of tinnitus from all of this computer usage, where I'm hearing that like sound that you hear with a modem, you know, where it like has the pulsing, but it's really erratic. It's not really rhythmic, but in a tinnitus form. So I feel like the more I'm thinking about that level of that instantaneous awareness and apprehension of a sense experience through a doorway, as I kind of hone in on that moment, you know, examining this in an intellectual way, but also kind of going towards that experience more, that some of the more subtle phenomena start to become more apparent. And yeah, and I worry about it too, because tinnitus is not very fun.
It's so provocative what you're saying, Jessica. It really resonates with me because, I mean, this is expressiveness of the body. I mean, you're actually expressing materially how the ideas were encountered, right? Assimilated, processed, lived, and then what they're expressing in turn. Sort of tinnitus is an interesting one because definitely it's a sense perception, but it's almost mind consciousness, right? It's like, is there or isn't there a sound? And that's maybe a really beautiful way to express how these ideas can even sit in us. Like, is it or isn't it there to be grasped? I'm really taken by that. You know, and it's not the way education is done. Say at like the college where I teach, I couldn't do this with undergrad students. But in fact, you know, when Dzogchen is taught among practitioners, like very realized being to their disciples, the learning is never manifested in a repetition of an idea, right? You would be told, like, I don't know, some 12-year-old tuku in training would be like told to stand up and sing a song of realization. And that would be it. It'd be like your tinnitus. It would just be like a direct expression of like what has hit, you know, and it's not necessarily about a craft, like a literary craft. It's more the poetics of that, the body able to, like a drum, receive imprints and resonate them out in an echoing form. I mean, that's actually like, I know you didn't mean it as a metaphor, but it's like a very apt one. Kansani, is that a hand or just?
I mean, what
could be?
Sorry. What I've been thinking about is really this idea of like opacity over like, let's say, apodactic certainty. You know, that I find those ideas existing in like Longchenpa's ideas around illusion. When you start seeing something as opaque, sort of seeing through the thing, and you know, like, I mean, it's not a complete thought, but as you were speaking, I was thinking about like illusion and opacity, you know. But yeah, that's all.
Oh yeah, it's so central, actually, what you said. I love that you brought opacity to this, because that's exactly it. It's not the illusion of things being false or unreal or untrue, but it's more like degrees of opacity, exactly. And the way we tend to react to our belief that we're perceiving opacity and what happens when that changes. And that is a very embodied practical relationship one has with oneself and would be affected by one's philosophical, spiritual, cosmological worldviews. Because opacity means one is attuned and receptive to the invisible, to the semi-visible, to the semi-material, the immaterial, to a realm of spirits, to, I mean, we know, even like the really good quantum physicists know that there are light waves and sound waves in deep space that are emitted from who knows what body, right? And it's very much, as you're saying, opacity is so much about how we train the mind, right? In art classes, so often you have to be untrained out of seeing like an outline over shapes, because you don't actually see that. Just Sesame Street taught you language, by the way, not sight, language, right? So what you're saying about opacity, like how do we train to see less of that in places where there is less of that, which is also a way of saying cultivating cultural practices where you learn to see things that shimmer, right? See things that only tenuously appear or disappear. It's very connected to the tinnitus at an aural level, echoes. Oh, Mateus.
No, I think Jonathan was starting to say something, so if he wants to go first.
Okay.
Oh,
Sure. Yeah, I had something on a sort of related note, and I really love the phrasing you used, a body like a drum. And I was thinking about some of these art projects that you showed us, and there's been this there's a statistic out there, that most people, whenever they view art, they spend maybe less than 3 minutes sort of immersed in it, and I'm wondering if there's a way that there's something to our kind of our mode of spectating art that is very much similar to this like anatomical bias that you're describing, that the Greeks are only looking at the pulse in this way, that there's this like musculature, a bias of that, right? So like if the kind of analogy that I'm forming is that like most of our encounters with art, with formal aesthetic experiences, seems like that it's also one of only looking at the kind of visual musculature, right? So then what would it be like if we were more attuned to this like topographical kind of pulse, right? Because like with the Kambalu installation that you showed us, most people in a kind of installation setting will maybe look to the media objects, to the flashing strobing lights, and maybe disregard perhaps the pulse of the chairs, the design of the environment, things like that. So it's a very sort of like provocative thing, because I don't know that I've ever kind of gone into an art experience with this thought that I'm going to let this luminosity enter me.
That's so inspiring, Jonathan. Thank you. And now you, Mateus.
Yeah, so I was thinking in these days, I was discussing with some friends of mine, because it's more of a big deal now around here, all these issues on the ontological turn, and from some new anthropological accounts coming from the Amazonian Amerindians and so forth. So I was thinking all this idea of the samsara and how these images, they are empty and they have no meaning. It is interesting because in this other cosmological view from the shamanism around the Amazonas river base, images are reality. So there is not something like something beyond this level of illusory images, but all around, what we call a spirit is also somewhat of image for them. So that this is also, there's a lots of confusion around how they relate to photography, because in many of these tribes, they don't really like it, because it's like you're stealing away their spirits. And so there is all these realm of images and spirits, and there's not really, these are not really separated things. So I thought that was very interesting. And at the same time, I was thinking about that notion of the schema of configuration from Sakai, and how in Brazil, there is a very complex schema of configuration to determine what is a Brazilian identity and what is this Amerindian identity nowadays. So the first time all these ideas around the anthropophagy. There was this anthropophagus movement, which was the modernists in Brazil were defining Brazilian identity through recurring to the images they were taking from native indigenous peoples. And there is all this issue of appropriation around this. But then we have anthropologists nowadays saying they were inspired in these modernists to go make their research, and they develop all this new mode of relating to ontological multiplicity. They talk about multinaturalism. They talk about ontological turn. They talk about ontopolitics and things like that. And all this is being produced to sort of determine the differences between different identities. And at the same time, this is coming from somewhat of a modulation of a previous appropriation to determine an identity. And so I was thinking about all these layers, and I don't know, I thought it was an interesting use of this idea of the configuration, the schema of configuration to try and determine many overlayered identities and differences.
Oh, thank you. That's so great. So you're already at week 4 of the seminar, because that's actually where we end with what you described. Because what happens from the point of view of, let's say, the realized being? Actually, what do you see? And next week, we'll talk about why people think you see nothing, and that's definitely not it. But it's something more like what you're describing, or also what Kinsani was describing. I mean, it's the illusory, seen as illusory without the veneer of opacity. Could be images in the form of like the spirit world. So illusion is the title of the 4th week, because that's where we end. That's where this path ends. You don't end with the real McCoy or something. It's like really a counter-empirical move. So that resonates. And absolutely, it's very interesting. You know, I think that's why I began with the little story about the 15 very modern, right, contemporary, urban, indigenous kids in Hawaii making video games. Because I think we have to take very seriously those who still know how to not want to be in a photograph. My own Qigong teacher, who is a Qigong teacher among many other things, that's actually not the main thing she does. She's actually a lineage holder in the Shinten Ujimen tradition, which actually traces its lineage back to Shaolin. And she is Shaolin, and you will not see one photo of her anywhere, ever. And I think someone's been completely banned from studying or anything with someone who tried to take a photo. And she's a modern Hong Kong woman, owns a construction company, has like grows fruits in Malaysia, does feng shui, all of that. But you're not ever going to take a photo of her. That's it. It's very simple. And those kinds of knowledges, awarenesses, powers, potencies, people carry. You know what? I think what I want to say is it's not a theory of the media or of anything. It's actually a power one has or doesn't have. You know what I mean? Like for us, like I don't know what it's like to want or not want my photo taken. So I can't claim that in some abstract theory. That's gibberish. That's definitely appropriation. And I have to slap a name on it, like, oh, I am now going to follow this indigenous practice. This is like what not to do, right? But for sure, we have to develop a different kind of sense and respect for people who can carry that capacity. So I like what you're saying, because it's a capacity. It's in you or it's not. It's not an idea. It's not a media theory, right? Though it gets theorized all the time. And as you point out, the appropriation is very real. And honestly, I actually, for decades, never called what I was teaching this. And I really experimented with slipping it into other things. I taught classes called Deleuze for a long time. I'm like, that comes close enough. You can do a lot of that. It was a lot of fun experimentation, but I think I'm doing this because actually at some point I felt the word indigenous is being used really flagrantly. And people have to start doing things differently is what I felt. And someone like, I think individuals have to sort of model what their practice is, and then everyone can. And the problem with coining all these really cool phrases, I mean, I tried that for a while and I thought, okay, that's not cool. Onto, there's a whole bunch of ontos, there's a whole bunch of epis, there's a whole bunch of, like, really, if you're a good poet, I think you can write beautiful, really cosmic, humorous poem. But like, really, the writer should be making fun of this and making us like laugh and cry at the same time, right? The multi-faced gods. So here's what I'll say. What allowed me at a certain point of my kind of critical intelligence of continuing on with some of these lineages I've been a part of is that there's a line I really love in Buddhism. It's a really important line. It's called, if you meet the Buddha, kill the Buddha. And this is why Buddhism still works for me, because you don't have to call it Buddhism. It doesn't call itself that. Dzogchen, by the time it says it can't be taught, it has like lost all ability to institutionalize. It's really kind of interesting. And I think that's the thing. Appropriation happens because you don't want to kill the Buddha. You want to like own it, claim it. It's on your CV, and like you're going to now market some workshops about it. And that's seriously problematic, you know? So I'm trying to, even though I have to call these things what they are, because that also is important, like the lineage. It's how you know, like literally us, that you're entering into something properly. You're not just hacking your way in and we're going to have like, I don't know, onto coemergence. So we have to do things properly, but then what you take out of it, I hope will have no names. Like really, you should kill the Buddha before you leave. Like you have to kill Longchenpa. Like you can't take the name away with you and not the substance, because the heart of the substance is exactly what happens before the name arises. So I hope that's what we will take and do something with. So I love what you said. Let's do the little last exercise I have, and then hopefully we'll have a little closing discussion. Okay. Oh, yes, Sebastian.
Sorry. We can talk about it later. It's fine if you want to do that.
Oh no, if there's
okay.
things to say.
Yeah, I just now, Mateus, you were speaking of images, and it made me think about aesthetics and how aesthetics has somehow morphed into this like severely reified connection that relates very narrowly only to art, specifically visual art, and how maybe aesthetics, you know, is actually a much more capacious, maybe not a discipline, but way of looking at things that has much more to do with sensorial perception rather than this reified discipline that sees an art object as this detached, you know, object of contemplation that is subjected to a gaze. So yeah, I thought, because I guess what you're getting at is a lot of it has a lot to do with you know, pushing back against reification and also substantialization of disciplines and concepts, and aesthetics is one of them that you know, succumbed to this reification, I would say, in a way.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. I've kind of gone all in on that potential, because if that is true, if it is possible to engage the sensorial dimension, it is definitely, it includes and expands art, but it goes far beyond art, right? And it actually touches on a lot of the ethical questions of our time. So that for sure, I mean, you know, like that's where my cards are, for sure. So we'll see how to do it. And I hope this class will give you some, some practical, they're not really tools exactly, but practices with which one can begin to do that in a concrete way. Because the sensorium tends to get theorized, affect is theorized. I find it hilarious. The theorizations of affect are, I mean, not hilarious, but it ironically perversely, paradoxically, that which is counter to theory is theorized, because wonderfully people recognize there's something there we need to know and to get in touch with in terms of sensing and so on. However, theory is our habitual way of relating to knowledge. And so that's why I'm beginning the seminar with the spectator who wants to know, and asking us to all contemplate, who is that in you? Like what is your own figuration of that? Who is that in your life? Who is or is not? And then how might you actually reform that or redraw that? So if you're game to do a little exercise, maybe in little groups, I thought we could meet each other and talk a little more personally, and then we'll come back. So I will show you the exercise, and then I don't know, if you don't want to do it, I guess we don't have to, but I would like to do this with you. Okay, so the spectator wants to know. I want us to think about the figure. So spectator may or not be a good word. I chose it because it's the word within art criticism that's under theorized. So I thought, well, that's rare, a kind of under theorized place. We talk about, we do a lot of things to the spectator, right? We interact with them, respond to them, perform for them, want to change their ideas, want to break them free of ideology. Like the spectator is very much an object of critical attention, but I was interested in the spectator really as a figure, as the mind of the spectator. And this exercise comes from, I thought it might be fun to play with Yoko Ono. I don't know if you know her work, Grapefruit. It just has a lot of these little instructions. So I wanted to play with the form of instruction. So in Kuriyama's book, there's different forms for medical, it's a kind of instruction manual, right? But for us, thinking about who we are in the world, to begin to give some practical shape to this, otherwise we can't ever get to a praxis, right? So could we think instruction as a form of whatever you want to call it? It could be discourse, it could be art, it could be whatever. And engaging any of the questions we've talked about, which I don't know, I sort of summed up in this form. If in groups, you might want to play this game for me and just come up with, you can do whatever you want, you know, you could write a haiku, or you could actually think concretely about something, or you could pose just a very abstract philosophical research question even. So you can use this however you will. And I'm gonna share a link and see if it works this way for us to do these on the same Google Slides. And if your group could, I hope you feel this is fun and interesting to engage a practical dimension. You know, we only really do this with children, actually, right? This is not how a graduate school operates. I feel a little anxious myself in this terrain, but whatever, if you rebel, we don't have to do it. But I just want to see what happens and what you will do with a little auto interruption. So I thought 10 minutes. And you could also like leave your group and come back if, you know, I don't want anyone to feel stuck or like leave the class because you don't want to be in the groups. I'm often that person. Shy, can't always relate to small groups. But it might also be really, really lovely. I just feel I already love you all. So if we could, if you feel willing to do that, oh, I'm not sure. I think I need Vincent's help to do this.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out how to do the breakout thing.
Yeah, I was thinking groups of 3 or 4. So if you could break us out into 4 groups, that would be great.
Okay, just a sec.
Okay. And in the meantime, I will share the link to this Google Docs, which if you wanted it, you will now have. Okay. All right, in the chat, I'm going to put the link to this Google Slides. And you'll see on the slides, there's 8 groups, because also I thought people might want to do separate things or whatever. So feel free to use it however you will. Obviously, the idea of this is not an exercise, but just the interesting little space for experimentation. Okay, so I think Vincent will send us on our way in a moment, but you can just look at the slide if you like.
I'm not really sure how to navigate this one. Does anybody know how to?
Usually when you create the Zoom, it has to be one of the options you've chosen. So if you haven't chosen it, it may not be possible. Let me see. Do you have anything at the bottom of your screen that says like options or breakout room or?
No.
Because can you make me a co-host?
Okay.
So let's see, it may be, I think one has to have chosen it in advance. Okay, let me see. Okay, yes. Okay, I do not have the option. It may not be possible. I'll just look at one place. Sorry, everyone, just bear with me. Okay. I think we might not be able to do this. Okay, I don't want to spend too much time on that. So we will get this organized. Vincent and I will organize this. I see on this chat. Oh, you can edit. I see. Account management. Do you see the chat, Vincent, from Page?
Yes, yes. I can't see any option for the breakout rooms.
Okay, it's possible then we'll do without that. So everyone, let's do it individually just for a couple minutes, and then just somebody wave when, just do it for a few minutes.
I just had a question. I didn't get it right, that we were meant to give our scores or use Yoko Ono's scores for instructions.
Oh no, you create your own. I was just showing Yoko Ono because it might have been mystifying, like what is an instruction? So it's just one example, but I'm imagining you could do very, very different kinds of things. So a little thought experiment to change the mode of reading, discussing, discourse. Just think of it as that kind of an experiment. But yeah, feel free to have nothing to do with Yoko Ono. That was not important at all. Yeah. So how about just 5 minutes?
just a moment, Una. Have you decided how to go with the student presentations and the final requirement? I think you're muted.
Oh, yes, there will be weekly. We're going to do some weekly work and then a final project.
All right.
There will be a couple options for the project.
Okay. I can just make a document and then the students can input their names and schedule when they're going to present.
Oh, you mean in-class presentation?
Yes.
Okay. Actually, I hadn't thought about scheduling that. Okay. So I will email you about that.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. So because we're, wow, already running out of time, I'm going to leave this incomplete and maybe we come back to it next week. And but anyway, the thought experiment has been offered. I invite you to not just think about not thinking, you know, which will be the topic of next week. So we will definitely think about thinking about not thinking and think about not thinking about not thinking. But at the end of today, just I would like you to leave with a sense of what is it I would actually do with this? Like, how would it, and that requires you to think about what are the things you do in your life. You can think anything for 2.5 hours, but there are only certain things you do in your life, right? If you sing, you sing. If you dance, you dance. If you write, you write. And so this practice isn't sort of in kind of performance of art style, inviting you to enter into somebody else's doing, but to take some of this into your own places of doing, and in a very subtle, like without name, see where could you even use this? What would that even look like? What would that be? I invite you to just carry that into the week and to report back next week, if you would. I would like to do a series of a little more practical, and I'll leave more time for it next week, so we can do these. And as Vincent just mentioned, I think the New Center seminar has these individual presentations, which are always lovely, and we can do those as well. But you can even use those to do this kind of work. So there will be, I invite you to experiment, because regardless of what you're doing, there's a different kind of data we receive when we experiment with certain ideas. And there's a certain conventional mode with which we engage new, other, different kinds of systems of thought. And I'm inviting you not to do that. I'm inviting you actually not to sort of modestly wait till you learn everything and then you have the right to say something. I invite you to renounce now at the outset any right to say anything, and therefore play freely with what is given. You see what I'm saying? It's kind of, it's like a little back door, but I think this will work. And it's an interesting experiment in how to engage cultural difference. There's a place one should never go, and one should sort of say from the outset, I won't go there. But then within that, like within the sensorium, as Sebastian was saying, there's a huge world of what you can take and use today. You don't even remember like what century Longchenpa was born, but that isn't really the point, right? He doesn't want to necessarily become an authority in that sense. So this is a really different kind of gambit. So to the degree which you're interested, find it relevant, motivated, engage some of this in the practices you are already doing, right? And that's what this little exercise was about. And arc spectatorship was just one example of a place where we delimit a space of relating to sensory perception. And it's a space where we aren't immediately penalized for not being able to conceptualize immediately out of our perceptions. So many parts of life, we're always using our senses. That's kind of all you got, right, to go on. But you have to immediately produce out of that. So art for me was a place I thought we could use to enter imaginatively to find more space and time to do something different. And for those of you who are actually professionally artists, I think then there's a whole nother layer that gets really interesting for you to explore, even to do a kind of art that might be less professional. Oh yes, beginner's mind, love it. Definitely. Beginner's mind is so powerful. It is free. You can all take it. You know, there's no danger of appropriation, because what are you calling yourself? A beginner. Appropriation happens when you call yourself an owner, an expert, an authority, when you start coining phrases, you know. But beginner's mind, to be a beginner of Dzogchen, like, of course. I mean, this is the trick. This is how to do it. Be a beginner of this. Be someone who has encountered it, like for the rest of your life. That's actually what the realized beings do. Like Longchenpa, forever, every moment of his life encounters wisdom, you see? So it's like really that, it's kind of easy in some way. But it's hard in a different way. It rubs against our sense of accomplishment, our sense of identity, our sense of credentialing. It rubs up against a lot of institutional places we have to survive and live in. So this is the contemplation as our introductory week. And, you know, I'm an academic because I love being in school. So I find it fun to think of things as homework. If you don't, if you find it belittling, don't think of it in those terms. But the homework, as it were, I'll talk about the presentation next week. But I would like us to begin by putting together this collective gallery. And it's really simple, an image and a paragraph. Whether the paragraph is a word, 2 words, you want to put a link to a 10-page paper, that's really up to you. But I invite you to share an image and text. That's simple. And here, if you could do it here, and I will move this section to the beginning. So it'll be slide 1. You won't have to scroll through. You have the link, but I'll send it in an email as well. So in case you lose it. And so about what? Well, that's up to you. Something about your encounter with either the class, anything in the class, or whatever the thing you've heard in the class become a part of in terms of your encounter with something in your world. So it's really quite open. Let's see what happens. And then the presentation, I think you all heard, right, that Vincent was talking about, is something a little more formal, the academic dimension of the seminar, kind of like the credit-bearing part, which is really interesting, isn't it? Like, at what point can things bear credit? Like, it's really interesting because Dzogchen is spontaneous, free and easy. Even the Tao is free and easy wandering of the mind. What can you build on that? Like, what kind of credit can you gain with that? It's quite a question. So we're going to do it both ways. And I will send out some written instruction about that. But as you could imagine, just as I wanted us to do these little spontaneous group things, the slide I'm asking you to do for next week, the presentation is just a more formal version. And you choose the form that means formal to you, right? Of your own like mini archive, whether it's 1, 2, 3. I mean, you could possibly do 5 different objects of a concept that for you is most relevant coming out of this course. So that's in rough guidelines what I think makes sense to do. And I think it's practical. It could be the seed of a paper. And if you want feedback on your idea, like we can meet outside of class or we can email, and I'm happy to offer feedback. If it's a seed for a creative project, like a proposal, it could be that. If it's an excerpt of something you want to write that's more that's less scholarly. That could also be interesting. I work with actually students who are in a lot of different fields. I work at a college where we don't have departments, majors, any of this. So I feel quite comfortable working with people where they are. So please feel free to let me know what you need. And you know, if you want to compare Longchenpa to like Hegel, we can do that. It's whatever you need. So please think ahead to that. I'll ask you to somehow communicate that with me by next week, so you know what you're preparing for the last week. And then in terms of anything on paper, you'll have a week after the last week to turn something into me. And that's just an opportunity. It's really, I invite you to really just think of it as a great opportunity for us to get to know each other and have a conversation. And if you want to make your presentations live, like by Zoom, we can set that up as well. It was really great meeting all of you today. I'm really excited to get to know all of you more. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
See you
Thank
next
you.
week. Bye. Feel free to email with any questions or concerns. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.